So should we be like doing a show?
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Eliot.
I'm Daniel.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you'd like to help us out with hosting this, or with the hosting costs of this show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia, where if you enjoy our content, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us today. We have a returning guest, Daniel, no longer talking about cartomancy. Now he's just here to talk about another random bullshit topic that we talk about here about RPGs and gaming in general. So today we are talking about game resolution mechanics. We're going to try to talk about what they are, different ways they're done, and try to go into the amount of complexity that players want to have in their games. Daniel, you've had a little bit of experience actually looking into this in a professional manner, as this is kind of alongside your thesis about gaming. I know that me and Jordan and I think Eliot as well kind of prefer a little bit more crunch in our games, a little bit more rules complexity. We like to have some rules to fall back on. We don't like feeling like we're out there and there's no rules to support our decisions or our as game masters, our game calls. What is your experience as to how the majority of people like it?
So I like that you refer to it as a random bowl topic, since I have a master's degree in this. Hooray! So I spent way too long trying to figure out like every angle of when someone says, this game is complex. What the hell do they mean? Like, it's one of those things that's so simple and obvious that that everybody understands what you mean, except when you actually try and like operationalize it for a scientific study, you panic because suddenly you have no idea what the word complexity means. So for me, just like gaming history, so I'm an old I kind of peg my RPG history to two different games that, like everybody else who's done RPGs, I did a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. And so, with my age, mostly in my formative teenage years, I was playing second edition back in the 90s. And so I love a lot of that really complex, crunchy stuff that's in old second edition, where, you know, you have to remember that everybody's got a different experience table and, you know, remember when the druid's allowed to turn into a wyvern and all kinds of weird stuff that it's just not rationalized like third edition plus has been. But then I peg on the other end to Cyberpunk 2020 is what I played so much of back in the day. And that has a exceedingly simple resolution mechanic for all skills, all attacks, all everything. It's always going to be, you got a stat, you got a skill, you got a D10 roll, add them together. Did you beat your difficulty number? Right? And so I can love games that are kind of on at least what was back then, different ends of the scale. Now, nowadays, obviously you have super simple RPGs and you have way more elaborate RPGs. So, I love them all, but I think that there's a time and a place, you know, that there's, I don't think that you should use the same system for every type of night.
You know, it's funny, since we've been cooped up in the house, all this COVID time, you know, I kind of, this topic reminds me of a weird analogy, so bear with me. So I got into coffee, which I don't know how you get into coffee, but I managed to. And I've always drank coffee my whole life. I love coffee. I drink way too much. But, you know, I mean, from the time of an adult till I was probably in my early 30s, I always, just was satisfied with the cheapest stuff. And then at some point, like, I decided to get nerdy about it. And I think that's kind of like people who like complexity. It's like when you play games for a really long time, or you play within one system for a while, it's hard to say. I'd like to know, what is it about a game that breaks people out of being content? I know guys who play longer than me, more consistently than me, for years and years and years, and they always play whatever D&D's out at the time, and which I would consider, especially the current 5th edition set, to be very streamlined and low complexity. Yet they're satisfied. Yet I also know some people who chafe under, D&D from the jump, and then will be, lifelong gamers, but never play D&D, and they play these wonky, crazy, complex systems. I wonder what it is. Is it a personality type that leads someone to want a certain type of complexity, or is it like the struggle for realism that drives? I know, like, I would, not to speak for you, Jordan, maybe you could speak more on this, but I get the sense from you that a lot of what chafes in 5th edition for you is the lack of realism. It's not that it's not complex, it's that it doesn't feel realistic, and oftentimes I always associate more realism with more complexity. Would that be how you feel?
Yeah, a lot of things in 5th edition especially seem very arbitrary to me, and it seems like anytime there was a point in the design discussion where they could have decided between trying to make something map to reality as we all expect things to work, or make things consistent with this arbitrary, very simple rules system that they have, they always decided to go with keeping everything locked into this simple, advantage or disadvantage, or, whatever rule system that the thing's based on. And I understand that there's, that whole 2nd edition history that Daniel was talking about of, every single thing that you do being a completely different sub-game bolted together. Some things are percentiles and some things are, D20 and whatever else. But yeah, like, I just feel like if your rules can support what your players would just have a common sense expectation of, being the cause and effect relationship for their decision based on their life experience with mundane things, then, that's doing a good job. That's rewarding people for making appropriate decisions. Yeah, I feel like I've rambled for a while now. I've got more things to say, but I'm going to throw this back to you guys now.
Yeah, so let me give you a framework, and you tell me how much it captures like your D&D feelings. So there's 2 words that we use a lot in like ludic studies, but you use them in real life, and I think you'll figure them out pretty quick. So like, you have fidelity and resolution, right? So resolution is basically how small of a slice something breaks the world up into, and then fidelity is how faithful each of those slices is. So you can have a monitor with 4K resolution or whatever, and so it's got very high resolution, but if the picture coming in has been distorted, then you've lost fidelity, right? It doesn't matter how many little dots it's being broken up into. So I think when we're talking about complexity, I think we're often talking about the resolution side of it more, where you're worried about how complex the model is that is recreating details. But I think what your problems might be is the fidelity, that what they're recreating doesn't actually seem like reality to you. Does that make sense as a breakdown?
I think that's generally correct, yeah. I mean, like, a game rule for, resolving some kind of action is just an algorithm, right? And so you've got these built-in, data structures that you're dealing with that are trying to represent, in strict, objective, quantified terms, what your character is, what all they can do, the sorts of actions that they can take, and those effects on the world and other, entities within it, all working within this interpretation that is just kind of like a string of equations that you have to work through at every step. And like, you could have kind of a breadth of rules that are all very simple to do, but are meant to cover a whole bunch of different situations. And that's kind of what the second edition approach was. Rolling percentile to pickpocket as a thief was easy. But it was completely different than your attack roll that had to factor in THAC0 and all this other shit. Or you could...
THAC0 for life.
Or you could do kind of a depth-oriented thing where you've got a series of actions that are meant to get, more and more specific, a multi-stage kind of thing. You could look at like skill challenges or, stuff like that as being a representation of that, but all of them working along the same basic operations that roll your D20 plus skill plus proficiency or whatever the hell. But yeah, like, if I don't really care which dimension of those a game designer wants to go with, I just want to make sure that you don't find yourself in a situation where, why can't I do that? Oh, because the rules say that you can't. Well, that's fucking stupid. I could do this right now. And, well, sorry. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm tracking. So, for me, what I feel like the great advantage of role-playing games is over almost every other type of game, almost, not all, but most, is that built-in referee that you kind of can have a lot more squish factor than you do in like a strictly adversarial game. So like, mechanically, war games are incredibly similar to role-playing games. You're usually moving more than one element at a time, but, if you read old D&D rules going back to chainmail, they used to suggest that you start off with like 4 or 5 characters because it'd be really annoying when your character died. That, clearly there's a lot of the same DNA. The resolution mechanics can be like identical from one to the other. But with a war game, you have to like specify every possible, ramification of the rules because somebody is gonna get to that at a table where there's only one player and their adversary there, and they're not gonna be able to come to a consensus resolution easy because they both want to win, right? Where, we've got dungeon masters around that are able to fix that for role-playing games. And so for me, I feel like I trust the dungeon master, game master, referee, whatever it is that you call them, more than I trust the rule book. That I am absolutely someone who is cool with, the GM being like, yeah, it says that this should happen, but the trip rules are stupid, so let's do it this way, right? I know a lot of people aren't that, and so for me, part of it just comes down to what is the ultimate source of truth on your table, right? Is it your game master or is it the player's handbook? And that's kind of like a philosophical problem.
I think that there's also something to say about the tone of a design in a game, because there's some games that feel like they are suggesting all the time, fill in the white space at the edge of the sheet with your own ideas. This is just examples of a theme that we're working on, and then other ones seem like it's more like we're delivering you the mathematical gospel, and this is how the game is played, and thou shalt play it as such. So there's some kind of like culture of play thing there as well, I think.
Yeah. Both in the book and just in groups. Like, I am amazed at how different culturally different groups are from each other. That, playing the same games, you hop from one group to another and like totally different parts of the book get used, and like a conception of what you were doing is very different. I'm actually interested. I know that you guys do a lot more like online play than I do. I am kind of interested if like the Roll20 world has kind of made a more standardized play culture.
How many games are you playing right now, Clayton?
Well, I'm a game master in 2 and a player in 2 on Roll20.
OMG.
The culture that I've experienced over, like, I don't know, 5 years since I've been on Roll20 is that it's not really all that different from the game table. It's still the game master leading the group in as far as like kind of establishing the culture of like whether or not we're going to be following the letter of the rule book, or whether we're going to be just kind of feel it out as we go. Granted, most of my experience on Roll20 is as a game master, so there is my bias in that as well. More than half of the time I'm a game master on Roll20. But whenever I've been a player, there's still just as much dynamic GM styles coming through for what the game master's vision of what a role-playing game should be, or what this particular style of game should be. And I feel it's still just as representative as what we the variety that we get whenever we all get together with our friends or at a convention and sit around a table and roll dice.
The first thing that I want to, since you're doing, we haven't talked exactly what it sounds like you're getting your research, your PhD, your higher education's in the gaming sphere, which is pretty cool. Is that true?
Yeah. So, I have a master's degree from Ohio University's media study program, and my thesis for that was studying complexity in games, specifically board games, but I wanted to be able to apply it to video games too. And so basically I wanted to see is a more complex game, more or less fun. And now I'm in my PhD work, and that I'm studying emergence, which is a related but different topic that we're not getting into today, I hope.
Well, the first thing that pops into my mind is, just like before I was on the pod, I listened to several podcasts just about different types of DMs, different types of players, different types of parties. Does the need, and did any of and this is open to everybody, but especially to you, personality types, do you consider, is there a way to break down different types of individuals? Does it get almost bring psychology in some? Because I could see that the types of players that yearn for complexity or yearn for simplicity, that has a lot to do with each individual. At what point can you suss out, like, this is just universally true versus this is highly specific? One person may hate this game, one person may love this game. I just have, as a designer, don't you just at some point just have to say, this type of person's not going to like this game, and that's okay?
So I think you do. I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all kind of game. But as far as like different player types, I actually think that you guys have talked about these on the podcast before, but there's a zillion different models of player behavior. And different people do want different things when they sit down to the table. So, GNS is one of the big ones, gamist, narrativist, simulationist. And so if you're a simulationist and you really care about how well it is simulating the world or whatever it is that you're wanting, that is important to you, and the rules have to do a lot of heavy lifting to make that happen. Where if you're a narrativist, maybe the rules are helping with that, and the like complexity of the rules are helping with that. But that's, that is a thing in the indie game space sometimes, but usually narrative is mostly in that like realm of imagination that's happening above the table, not like built into the mechanics as much. So, you have that kind of stuff, and then, who's the guy with the card types where you've got like killers and explorers and that sort of thing? I should remember, shouldn't I? Oh well. So you've got a ton of different types of players. But so one of the things I addressed with the thesis, so what happened? I have them play a board game, right? It's a board game I developed so that there wouldn't be any bias coming into it of, I hate checkers because I had to play it with my grandma and I hate my grandma, that kind of stuff, right? So it has to be a clean slate. Players come in, they play it. There's 2 different types of rule sets, and it's randomized which one you get. One of them, you have a single die roll to see if you blow up the other robot, right? You move your robots around, you try and blow up the 3 other robots. 1 roll for attacks, they explode or they don't explode. The other one has a system that's more familiar from like a D&D or a wargaming sort of way, where you have to like roll to spot, roll to hit, roll to damage, that kind of stuff, right? So mathematically, they actually were the same, that you have the same probabilities of blowing up the bad guy, but it feels like a lot more in one of them. And so I propose that is the more complex game. That type of complexity, by the way, is called procedural complexity, because it's just more procedures that you have to do. So in playing that, I asked people how much they played games, right? Did they have an extensive background? Did they play a tabletop game once a month? Did they play every week? Had they never played a board game before, kind of stuff, right? And so one of my questions was, I wanted to know if the players who had more experience liked the more complex system. And the odd thing that I got back from that, which was really true of a lot of my hypotheses, was I did not get statistically significant results saying that the more experienced players liked the more complex system. But when they wrote comments, they absolutely said, oh, I prefer that system because it's more like D&D, or I like that system because there's more going on and it feels more complex to me. But the numbers didn't bear it out. And so that's one of the things with social science, that there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that. And I should say, they give the numbers when they have only played one game and they're just evaluating it. And then they are given the option of playing the second game, and then they are able to write a qualitative statement and compare them. And so that's when they're aware of what the A and the B is when they're giving me that. So, do more experienced players like more complex games? I couldn't find data to say that they did, but it's just one study, and social sciences is squishy. Mm-hmm. And so I would be delighted if more people attacked it with with different methodology, or even reran the same thing and see what happens with a larger data set or something.
A question I wanted to pose to everybody in general then, sorry, Jordan, was that, would it be, as a gamer, just in our personal experiences, I know that me personally, a game typically gives me the feel bads, just generally when it breaks my sense of realism, or it breaks the sense of immersion, and that when a rule doesn't work, or, as a DM, that's why I try to kill those moments either with a rule or with a quick rule to get past them whenever it's like, what do we do in this situation? Because I feel like most people play, they want to pursue a narrative within a fictional world that gives them rule sets, and the rule sets are necessary to have fun and have a sense of like checks and balances against your behavior, but only to a certain point. But would you guys agree that when we're talking about when complexity gets in the way, or even lack of complexity when it gets in the way, is just when it pulls you out of the sense of, I'm in the game, I'm immersed, and now I have to pull back because this doesn't make sense to me, or I have to stop and look for a daggone rule, which is friggin' annoying.
I would say what breaks it for me is when the situation that we are in, and there is a rule or there is a call that runs counter to my pre-established understanding of how things are supposed to work. That's the part that gets me, and that really breaks my immersion in the game, and my ability to enjoy the game, is if my expectations are subverted, but just my expectations are negated in some way, so that I don't, like, the only way that I as a player experience the game is through what I've learned of the rules and what the game master is telling me. And whenever something happens that breaks the understanding that I have, that's when I get upset. That's when I start calling bullshit on the game or the game master.
Agree completely, especially when that thing that is breaking expectations is something that you have everyday experience with, and have a reasonable expectation that this or that should happen thus in such a way.
See, that's where I'd like to push back on you.
Anytime game mechanics are just like, no, we're working in this weird simulation we've created that has to be internally consistent but can ignore the world that we all know. Like, fuck that.
Well, I mean, see, this is where I kind of push back on a little bit. I mean, I agree. I want to play devil's advocate for a second. Is that, I think like a lot of things that people point to, I know we've done it on the podcast, is the hit points thing. We're in the middle of a campaign and everybody's getting a lot of hit points. And so when we're in these combats, they're getting pretty daggone epic. People are taking a lot of crazy big hits. And, I think I reviewed a combat just recently where I was telling Clayton, I think I dropped like 15 fireballs on the group or something crazy like that, maybe 10. And, those, in just the idea of a fireball, it's a giant burst of flame, an explosion that happens and you're really close to you. And yet that was not something that they were able to weather that and it was fun. But like when you're signing up for a game, don't you, the rules themselves almost, in my mind, it's like, well, yeah, we've all made this agreement at the table that we're going to adopt these rule sets as our reality for the next 3 hours. And I just think that like those limiting factors, even if it's like, well, I can't do this thing, that would be everyday common thing. But isn't that part of the game where you're supposed to take the menu of rules at your disposal and then play the game as best as it can be? And if you want to do something that would be in real life, commonsensical or easy, but the game doesn't like bear that out, like, isn't that kind of that player's kind of like, isn't it on that player to make a strategy that's good inside the game? Monopoly doesn't perfectly represent real estate markets, but yet nobody quibbles over its realism. Why are role-playing games any different?
Well,
but I would argue again that if Monopoly was a refereed game, then you would be able to do some crazy property deals and, leverage a buyout somewhere and all that kind of stuff, because that would add that flex into the rules. So I think turning back into the, where that started with, is that the problem with complexity? I would say yes. That is, it breaking you out, is definitely a problem that complexity can have. If a rule just doesn't, just takes too much or whatever. Or if there's just too many rules and you end up looking them up all the time. Okay. But I do think that there are other bad things and good things about having a complex game sitting in front of you. Like, so why I started the research initially is I was playing a fair number of war games and I was realizing I was never getting them done because, even if I'm setting like 4 or 5 hours aside to play some engagement, all the dice get rolled and then, I realize it's time to go and we've only passed through like 4 turns and I still don't know whether the Russians are going to reach Berlin or not, right? That complex games take a long time and that means you just get less story out of them in some ways, right?
Oh yeah. It reminds me of Diplomacy, though it's not a particularly complicated board game.
So there's different, there's a ton of different types of complexity, and so even though the like core resolution mechanics might not be all that complex in Diplomacy, what's supposed to be complex is you balancing your friends against each other and stuff, right?
Yeah.
The actual like
I was going to want to ask you kind of about that, because that's as a topic, diplomacy as a topic of complexity, is the fact that in a game that builds in social interaction, which D&D definitely does, that's a level of complexity that almost can't be fathomed. But especially in diplomacy, it's a great example because it's pitting the players against each other, but you have to socially work it out amongst yourselves. On paper, it looks pretty simple, but holy cow, it's been the most. I've never finished a game, maybe once, but it's my favorite game. It's my favorite game of all time.
Could I say about your fireball thing real quick that I think the problem is that, yeah, magic should definitely be much more dangerous in D&D, and fireball, the designers have already said, is disproportionately, more damaging than other things in that spell bracket. But it just so happens that, hit points just get dumped on player characters to the point that it's ridiculous, and, you're way outside the bounds of normal expectation with punishment that a person can take. But I think that, like, magic in a game should be, new things that are possible. What I was really talking about with stupid shit in the rules is when something is possible, but the rules prohibit it because of mechanical reasons or arbitrariness or whatever. This is the procedure that you do this by, and that's the way it has to go. So that's what I was talking about. Like, I'm fine with things giving more stuff to happen in the world. I hate it when boxes get put up that are walls that are arbitrary.
It's just so that I understand, I want to throw this out as an analogy just to make sure that I'm getting your point correctly, Jordan. Like in D&D, we're supposed to be having this epic sword fight, and I am not playing a fighter who is a battle master, so I cannot disarm you.
Exactly. It's fucking bullshit. That's stupid as fuck. These gated abilities that anyone that is proficient in combat should be able to at least attempt. But, oh no, that's a class ability. Only battle masters can try to trip somebody. Fuck off.
And then you get the Pathfinder rulebook whenever you start to go down that rabbit hole, which, I don't know, maybe other people who love Pathfinder don't find it. It's been a long time since I look at it. Maybe I shouldn't dump on it, but I looked at that book a couple months ago before they came out with the new one. I haven't seen the new one yet, but it had grown to absurdity. Absurdity. It's a book that I looked at and was like, I'm not playing that.
Yeah, but Pathfinder wasn't bad. No, I'll tell you, like, I've had around a book that I mostly just use to, like, intimidate my group, that we're never actually going to play this thing, but we have a copy of Traveler 5th edition running around, the big thick Kickstarter one. And so it's better part of 1,000 pages. And, this is a rule system that has a 2-page spread of rules, and all of this is crunch. There's virtually no fluff material in this thing at all. But it has a 2-page spread for not the way that you roll to sense the world, but for each individual sense your character may have, right? So it has a full spread on how to do smell checks, and it has its own whole system there, right? And so when you get into that sort of like super complexified system, or even with D&D with a battle master that has all these specialized rules to do all these things, anytime a system tells you, here's how to do a thing, then it is implicitly telling you you can't do it any other way, right? And so I feel like some of these crunchier systems definitely eat up a lot of the world in saying, here's a system for the very specific way that this is applicable. And it's not even like, so a lot of things your character might still be able to do, but then you realize that it would be a bad tactical option due to the numbers in the game, even though it feels like it should be useful. Like, oh, I could light this guy on fire. That'd be great. And then you look it up and it's like, oh, it'd do a D4 damage. Oh, yeah, we're not doing that. Right? So I think that's kind of the danger in having one of these really complex systems that has an answer for all of your questions, because you might not want the answer it gives you, where a live GM can be like, oh yeah, he catches on fire, screams, and jumps off the parapet, right?
Anybody played Seven Seas?
Yep.
No.
I haven't.
I feel like it was a really neat system, but, and I'm not going to pretend like I have it back and forward. I played it a long time ago. They did a Kickstarter. I bought the PDFs, I believe, or my GM at the time bought the books. We played it, and it was fun, and it really tried to delegate a lot of what almost what the DM's job was in those improvisational moments to the player. It allowed the system to encourage players to just imagine the most creative Errol Flynn, swashbuckling kind of actions, and it systematized it so it encouraged that, like the more complex it was. And it was fun, but it was kind of a shit show too. I feel like it's such a fine line to put bumpers on a player, but like, because like whenever you run, like the one thing that I don't like as a player is whenever a GM steps all over the rules, because something that I made my character for, maybe to either exploit something in the game that made sense to me, or maybe didn't make sense, but it's an exploit I found, and then it gets errated away because it disadvantages another character, or the DM just like, I don't like that. Or in those types of moments, there's obviously those moments when you got to fill the gaps, but I don't know, that's something that breaks me out of the realism. I find myself getting broken out of the game's flow more often whenever, like Clayton said, like whenever my expectations aren't met, and whenever you have a DM either who's not super familiar with the rules, or you're playing with a DM that maybe's played too much and they have like their own like 10-page set of errata that they don't share with you until you've broken the rule they don't like. That aggravates me far more than, not being able to, I don't know, trip a dude that I'm in melee with. You know what I mean?
Well, that's kind of getting the gamist angle of the thing, right? That since you're not, it's easy to get upset when you're comparing it with real life, but it's also easy to get upset when you're comparing what's happening at your table with your read of the rules, right? Like the mechanical world in front of you, the little machine isn't running the way that you think it should, and I understand getting upset by that, but I've also absolutely been that GM who's been like, oh my God, we've got to nerf this. How do we do it? Right.
But that's why I took that feat would be, I'm that guy.
I know. And that's actually, so that is one of my key complaints about, a lot, like the third edition plus of D&D, that it is very much it's a deck builder in a lot of ways, right? The real game is the metagame that happens before you show up to the table of picking the right feats and stuff, where, everything was so wild and wonky in the first and second edition that it's just like, did you know that guy can disintegrate people? I guess he can disintegrate people now. Who knew? And so it didn't really have that pretension of being all that balanced, where now you feel like D&D should be a mathematically perfect balance where everybody is able to do the same damage per round, or a equivalent amount of healing and buff effects or whatever, right? And so I think that there's a lot more room for people to get hurt in feeling like they spent the work, they did the time, they read their book, and they figured out that this feat plus this feat plus this feat, and plus this class ability means that suddenly you're able to do this crazy thing,
Jordan, how did you balance this with Apocalyptia? Sorry, Clayton. Oh, I was just curious. I mean, you two are the only ones who've actually created a game from scratch. How did you sacrifice? How do you feel like you've sacrificed realism or some of these things that you chafe under in Apocalyptia? how did you say, this is too much? I'm just going to make an approximate. Did you have to make any concessions for just simplicity? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I started out with a simple mechanic and then tried to do as much as I could without getting too far afield from that. And I don't think the procedure of it is where things get very difficult, with game systems most of the time. Like, I think the real difficulty that a lot of game developers fail at is making things proportional in the way that they should, like the values of various things. If you're talking about damage versus armor, we're talking about like, how good somebody could be at spotting versus how good somebody could be at sneaking, or, what have you. Environmental things like, can this caliber of rifle ammunition pierce through, this substance that someone is using for cover. I don't think that D&D designers spent very much time at all trying to balance things like that. They tried to balance things with this pre-existing idea of what all of their pieces that they're presenting to you to play with, how they're supposed to interact with each other, completely divorced of, any real world reference point for the most part. So that's what I did. I went with kind of like, that breadth first approach where all these different things are possible and a whole bunch of them can be done by anybody. There's very little gatekeeping kind of stuff. All of the things that would, amp up your character, just make you better at doing things that were options to start with that anyone can try. And just use the real world as a model because it already works. That's crazy, right?
That's true.
So I guess on D&D, here is my proposal. I believe that modern editions of D&D are not trying to simulate reality. I would also argue that they are not trying to simulate the old source material. It's not trying to be Conan the Barbarian anymore. It's not trying to be Lord of the Rings anymore. I would argue that modern D&D is trying to simulate a D&D campaign. That it is now a snake that has eaten its own tail, and it exists to create the same sorts of tropes and ideas that we've just come to expect since the 1970s. And so I don't know that it's a truly fair critique of it to say it's not realistic. I don't think anyone... I think you're absolutely right, Jordan. I don't think that anyone there is actually saying, is this a realistic decision? I think that they are just saying, does this feel like D&D? And their decisions do.
I think you're absolutely right about that, Daniel. I think that this is like this is a meta kind of product at this point. It's all like self-referential, and it's all just playing on, our memories and our affection for it from the past. At this point, that it's a rehash of a rehash, and I mean, yeah, it's the 5th edition of the game, so of course it's going to be like that. But yeah, it's almost like a parody of itself, and I think you see that in the culture of play that gets popular on like YouTube or whatever platform. Like, all the games are very jokey. There might be some dramatic moments, but it's mostly just for the laughs.
Yeah, and so for me, I'm going to be honest, I think I have played one game of 5th edition. I've got the books, I read the books. Cool. They definitely have a lot of, like, I like advantage and disadvantage. I know that that's somewhat controversial, but okay, that's a good mechanical workaround for problems that they had. Cool. God knows it's better than 4th edition. But if I'm wanting to, like, play it in that D&D pastiche, then I'm gonna play Dungeon Crawl Classics, because if I want it to feel like an old wonky a D&D campaign, then I need something wonkier. And Dungeon Crawl Classics will give me some weird stuff and have my character explode because I rolled a 3, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's me as a gamer. This is whenever my narrow path as a gamer, you know, I don't feel like a noob, or I'm not new to the game in any sense, but I know that of those of us at the at this podcast, you know, I'm the least, you know, I came back to it after a long hiatus. I played a lot when I was a kid, definitely played D&D. Stepped out and, you know, had kids, you know, went to college, didn't have a gaming group close for a decade. Started thinking D&D a little bit, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I found a 5th edition came out and some people invited me to a game, and I've been playing off and on ever since 5th edition started. And maybe that's why I always, you know, it's like I always want to play other systems, and yet every time I run a campaign, every time I think about a campaign, every time I always find myself at a gaming table, I'm always playing D&D, because I think that maybe at my core, that's the kind of player that I am. I just really love D&D. I love the memories that I have around D&D. And even though it's not D&D, because it's 5th edition, has nothing to do with Gary Gygax. Heck, I didn't even have anything to do with Gary Gygax. I never played 2nd edition. You know, I love the nostalgia of it. It's got D&D stamped on it, by golly. I just instinctively want to play it. And so, maybe that's the next step for me, is after this campaign that I'm playing in, I often find myself thinking these days, like, man, I just need to play something different. I need to find a different game to play.
Yeah. I want to raise one point in defense of complexity that is not from like a power gamey, crunchy perspective. I know we're getting a little long, but I've been thinking about this since early in the podcast, and I feel like D&D designers made the choice to try to cater more to the theater nerd type of gamers and bring a lot of those people in by, you know, minimizing the amount of math necessary and, you know, going towards stuff like that, making it a more theatrical sort of experience. But one thing that multi-stage resolution mechanic and used at interesting times and interesting ways, and they do suggest this in like the DM guide and a couple other places with skill challenges. I think this is one of the coolest things that has come out of this. You get this building of tension that goes along with you know, these ever increasingly difficult or different checks that you have to make, or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And that might be, you know, when you zoom out and look at it, that, you know, this stealth check and this other guy's, you know, persuasion check and blah, blah, blah. All these things have to build on each other in a complicated way. That can be really interesting and dramatic and, you know, simulate the kinds of scenarios that we see in popular fiction, you know, heists and chases and, you know, things like that. I think that the more you give a person to do and the more you kind of string them along before the big payoff, the more emotional and psychological engagement you have, that you're not going to get out of a, you know, roll and succeed or fail kind of check. So yeah, I think there's a theatrical case to make for complexity.
Yeah, it absolutely. And my reading of the literature and the work that I did backs you up largely on that one. So, all right, here's a thought experiment for you that people have done in real life. So if you have somebody and you say, hey, I want to give you a candy bar, and you just hand them a candy bar. Or you say, hey, I'm going to give you a candy bar in an hour. Both people get their candy bars eventually, either immediately or later, and they eat them. which one of those subjects, the one who immediately got a candy bar or the one who got it after an hour of waiting for it, enjoyed the candy bar more.
Yeah, obviously the one that had to wait for it.
Yeah, and the data supports it again and again and again. There's a million different variations on that, going back to World War II and pigeons. Delaying that resolution is powerful. And so, my argument in my thesis is one of the things that helped people like the more complex systems is that, just like you said it, that delaying that gratification and then hanging more and more onto it as you have succeeded in roll after roll after roll, then it's a much more powerful experience. And so for me, that was a revelation, since I love simplicity. I got really angry at wargaming mechanics that I was like, oh my God, I'm having to roll this handful of dice like 3 times to figure out that, my Space Marine didn't successfully hit anything. Damn it. I could mathematically simplify this with such a small loss of resolution. We could only roll a couple of dice and we'd be done. And I would be able to actually see if I've captured the Space Hulk this time or whatever. And so doing this research made me really realize the other side. And so I used to be a simplicity is king guy, and now I just feel like there's a right time and a place for all different levels of rules, basically.
Yeah, if you can get people hooked into that intermittent reward reinforcement loop, that's how you trick people into having fun.
Yep. Or by buying loot boxes if you want to get super creepy about it.
Right, hanging out at the slot machine all day.
Yeah, and so there's like real ethics involved in, somebody like me that's applying psychology and research to game development. You get to you get into some ethical gray areas that you have to be like, oh, is this too good? You're almost like athletes doping or something, where it's like, well, eating right so that you run fast, that's okay. But once you cross that line and suddenly we call it a steroid, then, you're out. And so, it's easy to get wrapped up in like, oh yeah, and if you do this psychological principle's at play and they're going to really enjoy it. And they're like, did I just make that addictive? I think I might have just made that addictive. Give me a sec,
I think you only have to worry about that in an electronic context, though, because, the system is being run in a tabletop game by the brain power of the people who are there playing it. It's different than, a mobile app that's sending you push notifications and stuff like that. But when we get to, where we're at now with the modern gaming scene and things like Roll20, I wonder if that kind of stuff, it seems like it's inevitable that it's going to start bleeding over somehow. D20 already has essentially microtransactions. They're not as pushy about it as other things are, but I wonder if there's also a big opportunity there. And this is something I've been thinking about for this Apocalyptia web app I've been working on, is does the ability to play the game with a ridiculously powerful computational device in my hand then unlock a level of complexity for the tabletop experience that before was just computationally prohibitive for anyone to juggle there at the table? That if we can offload a bunch of these mechanics into this thing that will instantly communicate everything that goes on in this virtual space to everyone else who's playing, do we care anymore about how hard it is to grapple someone? Like, could we make something that's like really a really solid grapple mechanic that maps to everyone's expectations of reality and has a ridiculous amount of options should you want to explore them, but, let the fucking processor handle the math?
Sure. but there's going to be disadvantages that come with that, right? Just like we were talking about how you build that narrative and expectations as you roll die after die after die, doing an engagement, do I hit, do I damage, all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If you just press the button and it says attack, you did 4 damage. Okay. Then you're denying that. No. And so there's trade-offs.
You build in a delay to build up that excitement.
Oh yeah, your player is going to be delighted by your little progress bar saying like, you will be authorized to attack in 12 seconds.
Oh man.
You're going to watch the digital dice roll across your phone screen and you're going to be on the edge of your seat until that die stops.
So I think that there's always going to be trade-offs. And so I think that sort of app-enabled, game is obviously going to be able to do some great stuff. But then again, it doesn't matter how complex and cool the like grapple mechanic is if no one can like see it work. And also the universal problem with, digital games, since I also do digital game stuff, is you have to explicitly give permission for anything you want a player to be able to do, right? That there is no like workaround anymore because, you only have your attack button, your grapple button, and your trip button. Those are the only 3 things that you can do to the ogre. Where, again, a squishy tabletop space, you can kind of fudge it a little bit, right? It's harder to have a house rule if it's an iPhone app. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would, Clayton, get in here, please. I want to just talk and talk and talk.
Well, we have 2 minutes before we hit the hour mark, so I'm not going to add anything else. Eliot, go ahead and talk about a point you got.
Well, I do. The one thought that I'd had during listening to that was a fascinating little back and forth. My mind jumped onto something that Jordan said, and I guess it was a bit derogatory, I guess, to cast on current D&D culture. That the current D&D game, for lack of a better word, I guess, it's made for the noobs. It's made for the general populace to bring in. They really are selling to the mass audience, mainly first-time players, people who saw it maybe on Stranger Things or whatever, and they're like, oh yeah, I remember that. But I think that's not bad. I think the thing about the app thing that came to mind was like, well, why would I not just play an MMORPG that not only gives me the immersion of, not necessarily realistic, but a far more complicated array of things you can do and cooldown times, visual stimulus, and all that stuff. I think that pencil and paper RPGs, which we're kind of talking about, is almost like a Luddite kind of phenomenon. It's almost it's something that I feel like a lot of people like us, we look back to our childhood and we're like, oh man, I remember I want to get this iPad away from me. I want to get away from my computer screen. I just want to get out a piece of paper. I want to, crack a cold one or whatever, get a 2-liter Mountain Dew and sit around a table with my friends and just enjoy a role-playing game together. And it's very much a tactile experience. Rolling the dice physically, I wonder if it doesn't make our hobby something completely different if we were to try to, say, incorporate the abilities of a computer to create a much more realistic, because, you're right, Jordan, you could make like a 5 or 6 page interactive screen where, everybody has a punch button, everybody has a trip ability. It's just, and the computer works out all the complicated math to decide how good you are at it, and you don't have to roll a million dice, but it's super realistic. At that point, that may be fun, but I still don't know that would probably still not replace this experience of what we would consider role-playing, tabletop RPGing. Because at a certain point when you build in the digital element, at what point are you just playing God of War without the visual stimulus of the graphics? You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Well, in Roll20 in your game, for example, on my character sheet, I've got my whip, I've got my silver dagger, I've got my hand axe, I've got my crossbow, and all this stuff, and all the different things that have to do with each one, and all the spells that might affect them. and it's all listed out there. It's the character I built, and then at the click of a button, all of that shit is right there. I don't have to go look up how much damage my Hunter's Mark does. I don't have to go worrying about, how many dice do I need to account for the radiant damage on my thing and blah, blah, blah. It's all just right there, and I just make my choice. And I do it week in and week out and have a blast along with all the rest of you all. And I mean, what I miss is not the physical dice and writing on paper. I miss having the face-to-face interaction with everybody and seeing, people's reactions to things in real time and, sharing space with each other. All the extra shit, I'm happy to hand that over to, a calculator.
Fair.
So I definitely agree with both of you that, I like the tactile experience. I like dice. I like cards, the actual shuffling, the actual rolling. But, the human element is the most important. But I absolutely think that we are going to be in a better place, with better apps to support tabletop gaming. Again, I love the Dungeon Crawl Classics, app support. It has a fantastic way to navigate through all that stuff. And I'm going to be honest, I had played, D&D for years before I played the old, Black Isle, Baldur's Gate, and Baldur's Gate 2. And that's when I actually totally understood the rules, because there was so much weird stuff in second edition that there was no way I was actually figuring out how all of those spells should be used properly, where, having a computer do the heavy lifting for me was a great step forward.
Yeah, the thing that we call tabletop role-playing games, it will get more automated, but until an AI is able to make decisions like a game master, it's going to be a thing that cannot be replicated.
Roll20. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The Roll20, I joke that if we ever do get to play in person again, I'll probably still just get a laptop or bring my laptop and have my Roll20 character and not even bother with the pen and paper, because it does a really good job simulating, and I'm sure Fantasy Grounds does too, of just simulating a tabletop experience that you can share with people from wherever they're at. I really love the whole suite of. I really love that program.
As long as everybody can see the screen, yeah, it's a great app to use in a face-to-face game for everybody to see the map and to not have to cart around a whole bunch of different mats or having a bunch of miniatures or just carrying around the little chits that you use or finding the coins that you're going to use for the monsters. It takes so much of that burden away that, if you have a way of displaying it, absolutely virtual tabletops are a great resource to have at a physical game table.
And there's a lot of other ones besides just Roll20 out there. You mentioned Fantasy Grounds. I'm going to save one that I've been keeping my eye on for a while as my geek thing, but Roll20 does not have the market cornered on virtual tabletops by a long shot, so I would recommend people shop around and find something that they like.
I think that's a good transition to go into geek things now. So I've only got one geek thing this week. I found a YouTube channel called Algal the Bard. He plays modern music with medieval instruments. I would recommend checking out his channel, specifically checking out his cover of Fear of the Dark by Iron Maiden, and also his cover of Nothing Else Matters by Metallica are particularly enjoyable. Interesting hearing them played using instruments that they were not designed to be played on.
I guess I'll go since I already mentioned something. The thing I've been keeping my eye on lately is the mythictable.com. Mythictable.com. It's a open source attempt for this gaming community to create a virtual tabletop from scratch, host it for free, put all the community's creations available, for anyone to download. So it's all like kind of a donation-based sort of thing. They've got a really active community. They've got a Patreon going, and they've got a regular newsletter where they explain, here's what our goals are for the coming month, and here's the things that we've already got done. Here's what our timeline is, yada, yada. It's all very active. And the stuff that they're doing is extremely interesting. So I would recommend people give that a look. Mythic Table.
So I can throw one in. So this falls kind of in the shameless plug territory, but so I'm involved with Rathacon, the Athens pop culture convention. And obviously there's been no convention this year because we live in the apocalypse. And so they've put together a con in a box. And so if you go to their webpage, therathacon.com, you can sign up. We'll send you a box, and it's going to have a t-shirt, some games, stickers, a bunch of stuff from all the local artists and stuff that make their living off conventions. And I'm putting basically a chapter of the book that I kickstarted, just the Toytastrophe section, so that you can do toy-based war games in there. So it looks like it should be a lot of fun. I've signed up for mine. I'm excited to get my t-shirt. So, check it out, and maybe, possibly, we'll have a convention next year.
Certainly hope so. I want to play. I want to run another game in the role-playing games room.
That's a great idea. A con in a box. That's a great idea. I always throw out weird ones. I'm assuming that this is going to be like, duh, everybody's done this, but I'm surprised how many nerds haven't read the Silmarillion. I'm going to recommend it because I think it's one of those things that everybody loves Tolkien. Almost everybody's read The Lord of the Rings. I actually have never read The Lord of the Rings. I'm currently just now leaving Rivendell for the first time. I'm just making myself read those books because I love Tolkien.
How exciting.
It is actually pretty exciting. I'm having a blast. I think it's going to stick this time. But
So wait, you're saying that you're reading the Silmarillion before?
No, I'm saying that I've read the Silmarillion twice, and I've loved it both times. I'm listening to it for the third time on audiobook right now, but I'm just now forcing myself to take my medicine and eat actually read the proper Lord of the Rings. I've tried since I was like 15, and I could never get out of the Shire, and maybe this is true for those secret closeted nerds like me who sit at the gaming table and pretend like they've read Lord of the Rings like I always did. I found that the Silmarillion I'm a history nonfiction kind of reader myself, and so I found the Silmarillion was so immersive. I like mythology and stuff like that, so not to go on and on about it, but yeah, definitely if you've never even given it a try, skip the first Genesis part, I would say maybe. A lot of people get hung up on the creation pages of like the first 75 pages, but when they start to talk about the Noldor and the elves and their battles against Morgoth, I mean, it just makes me really thirsty for the upcoming series. I'm hoping I've heard that they're going to the Second Age of Men and telling the story of Numenor, which would be awesome. But if that Amazon series could possibly go into the first stage, that would be the most epic fantasy anything ever. And to go on with that, Men of the West is a YouTube channel that covers all the mythology of the Legendarium and has YouTube video about everything in Lord of the Rings. And I'll zone out sometimes and just world build while I listen to that in the background. And that's why my stuff's so derivative of Tolkien. But anyway, if you haven't read the Silmarillion, give it a shot. It's pretty friggin' awesome.
All right, guys, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's do it.
I'm going to push my attack button.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.